Imagine a world where the most destructive conqueror in human history never drew his first breath as a leader, where the Mongol hordes never thundered across the Eurasian steppes, where cities like Baghdad, Samarkand, and Kiev were never reduced to ash and silence. This single thread, pulled from the loom of history, unravels an entirely different civilization, one with different borders, different religions, different technologies, and perhaps a very different future for all of humanity. To understand the stakes, we must first understand the man. Born around 1162 in the harsh Mongolian steppes, Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, began life in chaos. His father was poisoned when he was 9 years old. His own clan abandoned his family to starve on the steppe. He was captured and enslaved. Every step toward power was forged through personal catastrophe, relentless survival, and iron-willed ambition. His rise was not inevitable. It was contingent on 1,000 small miracles. The world of the late 12th century was a place of extraordinary sophistication and terrible fragmentation. The Islamic Golden Age was in full bloom. Baghdad's House of Wisdom housed the greatest mathematicians, astronomers, and physicians on Earth. The Song dynasty of China had invented paper currency, gunpowder weapons, and a naval fleet unmatched in Asia. The Byzantine Empire still ruled from Constantinople. The Khwarezmian Empire dominated Persia and Central Asia. This was a world of competing giants, and none of them saw the storm gathering on the steppe. Now here is the point of divergence. In 1203, during the critical Battle of Kalakaljit Sands, Temujin was struck by an arrow and barely survived. History tells us he recovered and went on to unite the Mongolian tribes by 1206. But what if that arrow struck just slightly differently? What if Temujin died on that steppe, unknown, unmourned, just another ambitious chieftain swallowed by the endless grasslands? The fragmented Mongolian tribes would have continued fighting each other as they had for centuries. And the entire trajectory of Eurasian history pivots on that single arrowhead. Without Temujin's unifying genius, the Mongolian tribes, the Merkits, Naimans, Kerets, and Tatars, would have remained locked in cycles of intertribal warfare for generations. The steppe was a pressure cooker of competing clans, and without a single dominant figure capable of forging them into one terrifying machine of war, that energy would have turned inward. Occasional tribal confederacies might have formed and dissolved as they had done before. But the unprecedented military innovation Genghis Khan introduced, the decimal unit system, the meritocratic command structure, the terrifying psychological warfare, would never have been born. The first and most immediate consequence of a Mongol free world would be felt in China. By the early 13th century, the Song dynasty in southern China was one of the most technologically advanced civilizations on Earth. It was the Mongol invasions, culminating in the brutal fall of Hangzhou in 1276, that shattered Song China and established the Yuan dynasty. Without the Mongols, the Song dynasty likely continues for another century or more, allowing Chinese technological innovation, gunpowder weapons, mechanical clocks, advanced printing, proto-industrialization, to develop organically and possibly centuries earlier. An unshattered Song China would have profound consequences for the pace of global technology. Chinese engineers in this era were already experimenting with fire-lance weapons, the direct ancestors of firearms. With another century of uninterrupted development, it is entirely plausible that true gunpowder firearms, muskets, cannons, would have been developed and refined in China by the mid-14th century, rather than slowly filtering west through a post-Mongol trade network. Europe might have received functional firearms technology a century later than it historically did, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the age of exploration. Perhaps the most staggering consequence of a world without Genghis Khan would be the survival of the Islamic Golden Age. In 1258, Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad, destroying the House of Wisdom, burning its priceless library, and massacring an estimated 200,000 to 800,000 people. Contemporary accounts describe the Tigris River running black with the ink of destroyed books and red with the blood of scholars. This single catastrophe arguably set Islamic scientific and philosophical progress back by centuries. In our alternate timeline, none of this happens. With the House of Wisdom intact and the Abbasid Caliphate unbroken, the Islamic world's extraordinary intellectual momentum would likely have accelerated rather than collapsed. The mathematicians of Baghdad were already extending algebra and developing early concepts in optics, mechanics, and chemistry. Without the catastrophic disruption of the Mongol invasion, It is not unreasonable to suggest that the Islamic world, rather than Renaissance Europe, might have been the birthplace of empirical science as a formal discipline, potentially triggering an Islamic scientific revolution a full century before the European one. Moving west, we arrive at Kievan Rus, the medieval Slavic civilization that historically was devastated by the Mongol invasion of 1237 to 1242. The Mongols burned Kiev, Vladimir, Ryazan, and dozens of other cities, killing an estimated half of the population of what is now Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. They imposed the Mongol yoke, a century and a half of tribute payment and political subordination that historians argue severely stunted the economic and institutional development of the Eastern Slavic states. Without this devastation, a unified Kievan Rus would have continued developing along Western European lines. Without the Mongol yoke, the trajectory of Russia's political development would be radically different. Historians have long argued that the authoritarian, centralized model of Russian governance, embodied later by Ivan the Terrible and the Tsars, was in part a response to the Mongol administrative model imposed during the yoke period. An unshattered Kievan Rus, developing organically toward feudal constitutionalism as its Western European neighbors were, might have produced a Russia that looked far more like Poland or Hungary than the autocratic empire it became. The entire question of Eastern European political culture hinges on this single invasion that never happened. The impact on the Islamic world extends far beyond Baghdad. The Mongol invasions destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, and sent millions of refugees flooding westward into Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia. These refugee movements destabilized the region and contributed directly to the rise of both the Mamluk Sultanate and, eventually, the Ottoman Empire. Without Mongol pressure, the Khwarezmian Empire likely survives, maintains control of Central Asia, and the entire geopolitical balance of the Middle East, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent shifts dramatically. Now we arrive at perhaps the most consequential divergence for the subcontinent, the impact on India. Historically, Genghis Khan's successors launched multiple invasions of the Indian subcontinent, most famously Timur's catastrophic sack of Delhi in 1398, which was only possible because of the Mongol world system. More directly, the Chagatai Khanate's pressure on Central Asia pushed the Timurid Prince Babur southward in 1526, leading to the founding of the Mughal Empire. Without the Mongol chain of events, Babur has no reason to march on Delhi, and the Mughal Empire, one of history's greatest civilizations, likely never exists in its familiar form. Without Mongol pressure reshaping Central Asia, the Delhi Sultanate, which was itself founded partly by Turkic warriors fleeing Mongol expansion, follows a very different path. The existing Rajput kingdoms of northern India, freed from repeated invasions, might have consolidated into a more unified Hindu political entity, possibly resembling a medieval Indian empire capable of resisting later Turkic and Afghan incursions from the northwest. The Vijayanagara Empire in the south might have expanded northward. The trajectory of Indian political unity, a question still resonant today, could have been answered centuries earlier. The Black Death's relationship to the Mongol Empire is a historical fact that most people have never considered. The plague of the mid-14th century, which killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, travelled along Mongol trade routes. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative peace and trade across the Mongol Empire, created the very network that allowed Yersinia pestis bacteria to travel from Central Asian rodent populations to Crimea, then to Italy, then across all of Europe. No Mongol Empire means no Pax Mongolica, and quite possibly no Black Death in Europe. Without the Black Death depopulating Europe, the social upheaval that historians credit with weakening feudalism and empowering the peasant and merchant classes would not have occurred on the same timeline. The Renaissance, which was in part fueled by the social disruption of plague, the wealth redistribution it caused, and the influx of Byzantine scholars fleeing first the devastation and then the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, might have been delayed by generations. The Ottoman Empire itself, which rose partly from the vacuum of Mongol-weakened predecessor states, might never have conquered Constantinople in 1453. The consequences extend to the age of exploration itself. European colonialism, particularly the Spanish and Portuguese conquest of the Americas beginning in 1492, was enabled by a specific confluence of factors: the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which disrupted eastern trade routes and drove European powers to seek western sea routes, and the competitive nationalism of post-plague, post-feudal European states. Remove the Mongol chain that produced these catalysts, and the entire timeline of the Americas' so-called discovery shifts by decades or centuries. Indigenous civilizations may have had additional generations of independent development before contact. The political map of the modern world, the nation-states we regard as natural and eternal, is almost entirely a product of the Mongol upheaval and its chain reactions. The borders of Russia, China, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, India, Pakistan and Poland are all shaped in some way by the Mongol invasions. In a world without Genghis Khan, the boundaries of these nations would be unrecognizable. Central Asia might be dominated by a surviving Khwarezmian cultural zone. Eastern Europe might be a Slavic federation rather than the fragmented nation-states that emerged from centuries of Mongol-influenced pressure. The entire modern political order is a Mongol inheritance. And here is the thought that should stop you cold. Every single institution you interact with today, every border, every religion's global reach, every language's geographic spread, the very structure of the internet that delivers this video to you, is downstream of a series of contingent historical events that the Mongol Empire either caused or prevented. The Black Death's DNA is in the labor rights movement. The sack of Baghdad's aftermath is in the political structure of the modern Middle East. The Mongol yoke's shadow is in Russian political culture to this day. Genghis Khan, who never attended a school and never wrote a single word, authored the modern world more than almost any other single individual. History is not a straight line. It is a web of improbable moments, each one hinging on the survival or death of a single person, the path of a single arrow, the direction of a single wind. Genghis Khan was one of those moments. Perhaps the single most consequential human being to have ever lived, not for what he built, but for what he destroyed and what that destruction made possible. If this alternate world has fascinated you, if you have felt that vertigo of seeing history from the outside, follow Altered Empires. Every week, we take these threads and pull them until the entire fabric of assumed reality comes loose. Subscribe and rewire your brain.